Welcome back to Level Pixel Level, and today we're just going to go over some advanced techniques with lattices. These are going to be some pretty advanced things, so if you haven't watched the beginner or the intermediate video, go check those out, and they'll be a good introduction to what we're going to be looking at here. So I've rigged up, I guess, Susan here, so it's a pretty basic rig. There's just a root node. I've got a simple eye look at here. I had a little node on the ears too. Make some cute shapes with those. And there's a very simple mouth rig on this character. The reason I did this was this is almost ready for production now, but what I want to do with the lattices is add a stretch squash to the jaw and to the head. So let's get right to it. I'm just going to go to Profile View. So I'll go View, Viewport, Right. I'm going to click Add Lattice, and I'm just going to move this down over here, just over the jaw area, and I'll flip to my Scale tool to just scale it up a little bit and in. And you know what I'm also going to do is I'll go back to move and I'll just move it forward, and I'll go back to rotate and just rotate it a little bit. I'm just going to go to the front view actually, and I just need to move it over. Now I'm just going to go to the item and location. I'm just going to add 0. So there's my jaw lattice. That's ready to go. I'll go back to side view, and I'm flipping views just by hitting 1 and 3 on my number pad. I find that a little bit quicker sometimes than actually switching views with this gizmo up here or the view option here. So I'm going to add another lattice. And this is just going to be living sort of in the top head region, just above the nose actually. That looks like a good spot there. Just going to scale it out a little bit, and I'll just keep moving it around until I get it across that face. I want it to encompass the entire head, and we're going to move it over the ears in a bit as well too. So right there looks good. I'll go to front view, and again I just need to center it. So under location, under the X, I'll just put 0. And I'm going to scale it out to encompass the ears as well. Okay, so that's looking good for those two lattices. Let's start rigging up the bottom one. And what I'm actually going to do is select on both the lattices, click on the rig itself. I'm just going to go to View, Local View, Toggle Local View. I don't need the monkey asset visible while I see it. So I want to add the lattice to this rig, and there's going to be a problem that we're going to hit later on. I'm going to rig it knowing that I'm going to hit this problem and just show you a technique to get around it. I'm going to flip to Edit Mode, and I'm just going to hit Shift A to add a new bone. And we're going to rig this similar to what we did with the intermediate rig. So I'll just grab this bone down over here. Once I have it in a good spot here, I'm actually just going to hit E to extrude it. Now it's going to extrude out like that. If I click on this bone and shift click on this one and do Control-Alt-A, it's going to align the bones. The menu command for that is Armature, Transform, Align Bones. Command-Alt-A on a Mac or Control-Alt-A on a Windows machine. The reason I did extrude there is because I want to use the Bendy bone option here. So I'm going to go back to pose mode to show you what I mean. When I click on this bone, and I come to the bone tab under Bendy bones, I'm just going to put this up to, let's do 16. Now when I grab this controller and I rotate it, I get that really nice bendy bone. Let's keep going with this. Let's actually take this bone here. I'm going to go back to Edit Mode. I'll do Shift D and scale this bone. And I'll do Control-Alt-S to scale this bone in. Now the function for that, the tool set for that is right here, is called bone size, which just allows you to change that bone size. This is just a display setting. I'm going to flip back to pose mode, and from this bone I'm going to hold shift and select this one, and I'll do Control-Shift-C. This brings up add a constraint with targets. It's a little bit quicker to add constraints, and what it's going to do is it's going to add a constraint from the parent here to the child. So first selected, and then your second selected. It makes it just a little bit easier to add constraints dynamically when you're rigging objects, especially when you're rigging a ton of pieces. So hold this, I'll shift click this one, and I'll do Shift Control C, and I'm going to add a copy transforms. Then from this bone, I'm going to shift click on this bone, the bendy bone here, and I'm going to do again Control Shift C, and I'm going to do a stretch 2. So now I'm going to go back to front mode. I have this set up, but you see that that's kind of acting a little bit weird. Let's get into why that is. I have a dependency in my scene right now. I'm going to go to edit mode and go back to pose mode. And this bone here right now is parented under this bendy bone right here. But I also gave that a constraint to this control right here. So if I select on this bone and go to the constraint tab, I have a stretch 2. And you can already see how it's a cyclical operation. Maya handles things like this a lot better, and the node editor Maya does this in a great way, but everything in Blender is linear, so it's really tough to have something like this. Not that you can't. You can actually sort of force this across the dependency editor if you're using something called the animation nodes. It has some pretty cool effects that let you avoid this. So to get rid of this dependency, I'm just going to go to edit mode. And with this controller selected here, I'm going to go armature, parent, clear. Clear parent. Now when I go back to pose mode and I move this around, I've removed that dependency. So I'm just going to zero that out. And I have that nice rotation and that translation as well. So I'm getting both with that. I'm going to add one more controller here, and we'll talk about why I'm adding it later. I'm going to duplicate this bone. And if you hit the move tool on your tool settings here and flip from global to normal, what this allows you to do is move the bone on its normal. And this one doesn't need the B bone, so I'll put it to 1. And I'll just move that down there. And now I can just move this along its normals. This is going to hold the weights at the base of the lattice in a bit. We're actually going to normalize the weights of the lattice. So I click on the head of this bone, I do Shift S, cursor to selected. I click on the tail of this other bone, I do Shift S, selection to cursor. Now I have an interesting rig setup. I don't need the constraint on this bone actually, so I'm just going to click it here and remove it. So let's connect the lattice now to this. So with the lattice selected, shift click on the rig and just do Control P, armature to form. What this does is it makes the lattice a child of the rig for us, and it also adds the modifier for us with everything set up. It's just a bit quicker way to add all those things. It will not add any vertex groups. We have to do that manually on a lattice like we did in the last video. I'm just going to rename this to jaw squash. So I'm going to add 2 vertex groups. And across the W resolution, I'm just going to add a bunch of segments. Actually, let's do 14 to match the bendy bones. And under interpolation, I'm just going to flip everything to linear just to keep everything stable and consistent. Now, just back on my rig really quickly, I'm just going to rename these bones. So this one here is going to be jaw to form 01. This one up here is going to be jaw to form 02. This is going to be jaw controller. And I'll just call this mechanic jaw for now. So I'm going to select back on the lattice and I'm just going to go to the vertex groups. The first vertex group I have to rename manually. I'm going to call it jaw to form 01. And I'll just name the second vertex group jaw to form 02. Now I have to create these vertex groups manually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to edit mode, and they do not normalize. You have to normalize it yourself, meaning that you always want your vertex group data to add up to 1 on one vertice. I'll show you what I mean right now. So I have jaw to form 01 selected, and I'm just going to click assign. Where it's blue means it has 0 weight. So I'll select jaw to form 02, and I'll select the inverse. I can do Control I for that, or I can just manually come in here and select it. And I'm going to click assign. Now when I flip between the 2 groups, I have a really nice weighting of 1 to 1, but what you might have to do is manually set a fall off on this. I'm going to select on these pieces here, this vert row right here, and I'm going to put the weight to 0.5 and assign it. Now on jaw 2, it does not normalize, so it stays at 1. So right now, if I add up the total weights on these vertices right here, it's going to be 1.5. These ones these ones are going to be 1. What this means is that I'm going to get some double transformation happening there at the 1.5, and I don't want that. So under jaw 02, I'm just going to assign it to 0.5 as well, and that's giving me a fall off between those two vertex groups. So now when I click the rig again and I go to pose mode, and I click on this jaw control and I start moving it around, I'm now moving around that lattice. I'm getting a really interesting fall off there. So let's actually make this a little bit smoother. Let's continue to work with these weights. So right now I have it going from 1 to 0.5, and I'm going to keep going here. So this one here, I'm going to select these, and I'm going to put it at 0.25 and assign it. And then this one here, this row right here, I'm going to put it at 0.75. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm making a smooth gradient across my weights. So I'll select jaw 01, and I will select these verts here, and I'll set it to 0.75. And then I'll just select these ones here, and I'll set it to 0.25. Now I've built a gradient between the two. And if you're working with mesh, you can auto-normalize this, and you could probably auto-normalize this with Python code as well. I should actually write a tool to do that. For right now, I'm just calculating between the two to get that fall off. But now when I go back to my rig, so I'll go back to object mode, select on my rig, and when I move this around, I now have that nice fall off with that nice static piece at the top. Let's try this on the mesh. So I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'll go view, local view, toggle local view. If I select on the mesh and go to the modifiers, I'm going to go to lattice, and I'm going to add the jaw squash here. I'm just going to move it above the subdivision. You want to keep your modifier stack clean in that you want most of the calculation to happen before the subdivision, so it's happening on less mesh. Let's check it out when I move this. Yeah, so I'm getting a really fun jaw stretch squash there. So now as an animator with one control, you can just get a lot of movement out of that piece, and it's fairly stable. But let's talk about an issue with this right now. So I'm just going to parent up some pieces on this rig. With the rig, I'll go view, local view, toggle local view. And I'm just going to select this one, and this one here. Shift select my root node. I'm going to go to edit mode and go to armature, parent, make. Keep offset. So now when I try to move the entire rig, I have a problem. Let's talk about what's happening here. The monkey right now has an armature. The armature is affecting the vertices of this mesh. So if I go to item, you'll notice that the object location is still at 0. The lattice is also affecting the mesh of the monkey. So right now it's still at 0. The problem is that the lattice and the armature are both affecting the monkey in edit mode at the same time. Even my lattice is still technically at 0 as I move this rig away from origin. And this is called a double transform. And it kind of sucks because you want this functionality of the lattice, but now it's broken. Some of the armature pieces will still work, but it's just not ideal, and there is a way to get around this. And what we need to do is actually build a second rig. Now we've already built this rig, so we're not actually going to build a second one right now. We're going to remove this rig from the other one. So I'm going to go to view, local view, toggle local view. I'm going to select these pieces here. I'm going to go to edit mode, and I'm going to hit P on my keyboard. That's to separate bones. That function menu is right here under armature, separate bones. Separate bones. Now I've made a new rig in my scene. Let's exit local view and talk about this one. So I'm just going to rename this quickly to rig.jawsquash. So remember, the lattice only affects the mesh when the edit mode vertices are moved. But when I move the lattice in object mode, it does not affect the mesh. And we're going to use that to our advantage right now. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select the lattice itself and the rig jaw squash that we just created, I'm going to shift click on the Susan rig, and I have the root node selected. I'm going to go to Pose, Parent, Bone. Now, when I move this controller, see how I'm moving the lattice and the Susan at the same time? This is because the lattice is now moving in object mode because it's a bone parent, but the armature that's controlling it is as well. And now I can take this and still move that around. Oh, I just have to connect that up. So if I select this from Susan rig, I want it to go to jaw squash. And when I go to pose mode, there's that stretch squash. And on this rig, I still have this movement. Now, unfortunately, it really sucks as an animator to have to go between two rigs to actually animate something. So what I'm actually going to do is add another bone to the main rig that constrains to the secondary rig, that pushes it around with a constraint. So first thing I'm going to do is select rig.jaw squash. I'll just go to edit mode. I'm just going to duplicate this bone here by hitting Shift D, and I'll just hit escape so it doesn't move anywhere. I'm going to go to armature, separate bones. Separate bones. I'm going to go back to object mode and select that new bone that I made there. I'm just going to shift click on Suzanne rig, and I'll just do object join. That's just so I could have that bone in the exact same place. So now when I go to pose mode, I have this controller here in the same place as that other bone. And let's just change the viewport scale on it. So I'll go to edit mode, bone size, and just scale that up a little bit. And I can even just scale it in space as well, just so it's in a different location. Actually, in pose mode, I'm also just going to give it a shape really quick, just so that I can verify it's a controller. I'll just give it the shape mouth for now, just so it's a circle. So I'm going to rename this first too. I'm just going to call it jaw squash, and I'll just copy it. Now back at our jaw rig squash here, I'm just going to go to pose mode, and this controller down here, that's the one we want to constrain. So that one now is going to add a bone constraint, a copy transforms, and it's going to be looking back at Suzanne rig. Now it's going to break it first because it's just going to the origin of that rig, but the bone that I want to go to is jaw squash. So now when I click back on the Suzanne rig and I move it, oh, see, I forgot to parent that up. So this controller here, I'm going to click on it. I'm going to shift click on the root node. I'm just going to flip to edit mode and do armature parent make. Keep offset. Now when I go back to pose mode and I move the root node around, I can move that, and within the same rig, I can move this. So what I can actually do is hide the lattice and the secondary rig there to move this around. And now with just this simple rig, I can get some really fun shapes. So that's a far more advanced setup to a lattice, and you can even keep going with this where on the mesh itself, you actually go to vertex groups and add a group here called lattice jaw. And if you flip to edit mode, you can just select a bunch of vertices and assign it to that area. I'll assign it with a weight of 1. And then if I go back to my modifier under the lattice option, it can actually take a vertex group. So I can type lattice jaw. That way nothing else outside of that area is going to be affected by this lattice. And I'll show you why that might be an issue. So if I go to front view and bring this ear down, and I'll just go back and I'll remove that vertex group to see what's going to happen. As that ear enters the lattice, the jaw now moves it. So the jaw lattice is now moving the ear. When I input that vertex group, it isolates the lattice to that area. So I'm not worried about other pieces being affected by it. So check out the demo files for this video. Go to Gumroad, download them, play around with them, and really break down what's happening in the rig. Remember, everything in Blender is linear. So I have my rig, my main rig, that pushes the lattice and the secondary rig, and both of those affect the mesh. I'm moving the rig in pose mode, and because the lattice and the secondary rig are both bone parented, they're being moved in object mode as well. And it's not until I actually activate that controller on the rig that I get the stretch squash and avoid the double transforms. So I know I went through a lot here, and I can keep sort of doing more advanced lattice videos as I go forward. But this was just an advanced one if you are looking to add stretch squash to your model in an interesting way outside of your main rig. There's other ways to add stretch squash where you don't add a lattice, where you just use rigging. But I just want to show some advanced features with lattices and rigging. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.